IIIF. With Avalon 7 being able to generate IIIF manifests and IIIF as sort of a pivot point in the community, we wanted to make sure that was available. The other thing that we had in mind is that upgrading the media player in Avalon traditionally was sort of a big task or a chore, and having it as something that's sort of separate that could be used by others in the community easily, as well as us, whether we're working on our current code base or on a Hyrax-based Avalon. It made more sense to sort of break it apart into this sort of shared component architecture that we've been having some success with. And we have existing sort of practices for this. We have a structural metadata editor that we created for Avalon, and then we have the IIIF timeliner tool. So, communicating via IIIF and having these sort of components being able to be easily dropped into the application, saves us a lot of development time and also allows us to work with other people, like we work with Digerati on the IIIF timeliner, to be able to say, here's this app or here's this component, and to be able to more easily integrate it into our own stuff. And then, of course, making it available for anyone in the community who wants to. For the technical nitty-gritty, I'd recommend watching this presentation that Danaji Wathana from our team gave at Virtual Connect 2020, where she goes into more of the technical aspects about how it all works. Today, I'm just going to give a brief overview and then a quick demo. So Avalon 7 is the current Avalon release. We have an endpoint already for IIIF Presentation 3.0 manifests, but we're still using the old player. And we decided not to replace our current player, which is based on a library, Media Element.js, with our new IIIF player, just because in the current code base for Avalon, it is a big job just because of all the dependencies and assumptions that are made between the player and the application. But Avalon on Hyrax, which we're working toward, the goal is to always use IIIF manifests to feed the player. So it's natively talking in IIIF back and forth. And the work that we're doing now will allow us to just sort of pop in the media player and go. So the latest release of the IIIF media player was May 2021, which is a 1.1 and has stuff like the ability to change quality selections, a parser update for presentation and manifests or the captions, structure navigation, and nested structures. And the code is mentioned in Samvera Labs. And the main way we want people to be able to use it is, of course, they can go to Git and grab it, but we're also publishing it in the Samvera namespace in NPM. And I think that's what I would expect most people using it to be able to get in. And you can see down here's the link to the GitHub repository, which is just called IIIF React Media Player. Okay. So I'm going to switch over to a demo. So the demo link here, samvera-labs.github.io/IIIF-react-media-player. I was going to put this in the chat, but I don't have it easily on my clipboard. But I would recommend everyone, please go here and check it out. I'm going to show it off real quick, but of course you're free. This is public. It's a representation of sort of everything from the last release as is now. Let me go ahead and share my browser here. Next up. So this is using a library called Style Guidist, which was recommended to us by Adam Arling. And basically, this is just a demo that shows all of the components and then how to actually use them. So you can see here this is sort of the style guide, but it's also sort of living documentation. And here you can see these three blocks are the three sort of separate components of the player. So it's the IIIF player, which is the media player itself, structured navigation, and then the transcript component. And the idea is that you can see here, there's just this import statement, and people can import whichever components they like just right to the application. And you can see just some basic documentation here. It's basically just looking for a manifest, and then it will take that and parse it and render everything as you see here. So this first example basically contains all of the components that we have, these three at once. So there's the IIIF player up top, and then the structured navigation component down here, and then the transcript component over here. So for the video player, we're using a library called Video.js. Again, we were previously using one called Media Elements, but there were things about Video.js, that were very attractive for, moving to a new application. And particularly, we were running into bugs with Media Elements that were sometimes hard to figure out, and Video.js has a lot more community support behind it. So you can see, while it's not feature parity with our current player, all of the basics are here, playback, volume, caption control, quality control for adaptive streaming, and then full screen. The other thing that's just been recently added that will be part of the next release is I can use the arrow keys to come back here. All the hotkeys have been re-enabled from the existing sort of media player that we're using in Avalon. And you can also see that in this structured data, these chapters are all live, and clicking them, everything that's down here is hooked up directly to the media player, so that users can, navigate just by clicking. And then this transcript component you can see here. So one, we made the decision to make sure that we could have as many transcripts as possible. So you can see here that there's a whole ton that can be specified in the IIIF manifest file. And some neat things here. So we have one transcript. You can see here transcript one, which is this basic sort of VTT style where we have the captions rendered down here. It's navigable. It's hyperlinked. And then we have some others here. So transcript in MS Word, for example. Might not render right away. There we go. Which is a Google Drive-based viewer, basically to allow flexibility for plain text or other documents to be rendered inside. So part of the work that we're currently doing is also figuring out how to represent transcripts more broadly, and then be able to render them. But for the time being, this is allowing us to, basically use transcripts from a variety of sources, which they sort of, exist in the wild as Word documents, PDFs, plain text, et cetera, and be able to render them in the player. And then there's a download button for convenience as well. And come down here. So you can sort of see from the structure, it's pretty easy to read in terms of what needs to be done, or how you define these transcript files when you're feeding them into the player. This big array of information, and then these URLs to references. So we go down to structured navigation. So you can see basically, again, a representation. In this case, we have an example item of a 2 CD set of Mahler Symphony 3, broken up into these tracks. And so, this can be styled however, but we'll basically, take this JSON representation and render it out. And structured navigation, could be used, again, without these other components, or, in conjunction with them. And then finally, the transcript component is the one we're working most actively on. So you can see, note, this is rendered with dummy data. So it looks very similar, but again, it's got sort of this, listing with timestamps on the left and text on the right, each into paragraphs. And when hooked up with the media player, clicking these will navigate up there. And if you want to, you can also take a look at the JSON structure themselves to see exactly how the stuff is being passed through. But the idea is really just that everything will be in represented in the IIIF manifest, and then come in. So what we're using to parse the IIIF manifest is the manifesto community gem from IIIF, which works really well. So that basically, reads the IIIF manifest, pulls all the relevant data, and then this application, basically restructures and renders it out into the player. And so, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, while we won't be putting IIIF player and all this sort of stuff into the next release of Avalon, we will be putting the transcript component into the application in the same way that we've done for structural metadata editor and the IIIF timeliner. Go back to PowerPoint. So the next steps are the 1.2 release, which is coming this month. And that includes the hotkeys for the player, the transcript component, and a CSS fix that before made it difficult or bad for the CSS to get bundled up properly for delivering the application. But all this you can see, it's in the main branch, which is the what's hooked up to the demo site right now. So not a lot will change for the next 1.2 release, but once it's live, we'll be announcing it, publishing it to NPM, and asking people to, basically give it a try and give us some feedback. Some more next steps are, of course, like I mentioned, adding the transcript component to Avalon 7.3. And then more features. So, this is pretty minimal in terms of what Avalon currently provides. And things like, playlists, embedded contexts, further transcript work are all things that we would like to, keep working on as part of this application. And the other things, feedback from early adopters. There are some people who are very interested in trying this out and using it. And I think we'll get a lot of useful feedback from them. The other thing we're thinking about is, branding. It's maybe not a super practical concern, but the IIIF React media player is kind of a handful, and I want to make sure that we are letting people know, what this is in an easy way. And of course, non-IIIF. So people have expressed to me that in addition to being able to, read in IIIF manifests, having the option to also be able to read in some sort of structure of data to use it even outside of a IIIF context would be nice. So those are things we're looking at. So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions if anyone has some, or send you more resources.
John, I had a question for you. For simpler cases of just playing video where there isn't a lot of, like, I get that the complex transcripts and the structured navigation. Have you evaluated or do you have thoughts on the pros and cons between just using the UV to display the media versus using this player?
Yeah. Actually, at one point I had a slide that I took out that was like UV versus this. So with UV, it's my thoughts in a nutshell are, UV number one is pretty heavy and the UI is very specific. And this is really sort of, I don't know, it's a kind of a complement or a contrast where this is much lighter weight and the individual components are sort of designed to be used independently if needed. So I think there are so many considerations, and UV is such a big project that I think there's always going to sort of be, that part of it. And so getting away with, I guess, using, the manifesto library to basically do all the parsing, work, and then be able to deliver this much more lightweight thing has sort of been the trick. And from what I've heard, it's people are more interested in, I just want a media player rather than I want, the Swiss Army knife of, libraries to render everything on a page.
Yeah, I think that there's a contrast between that and the idea of wanting a uniform experience, right? And things if you've got on the image page it looks one way, and then on the video it looks completely different. Like there's definitely an argument to be made that the uniformity has value. But I get that the big key word in universal viewer is universal, and that inherently means that there are UI trade-offs.
Yeah, I think the goal here is, just as light as we can, possibly get it with, the exception of, the media library itself and having to depend on React.
And I think, sorry, Maria, that the UI trade-offs are a key thing here. That is, we wanted to have greater control over and customization over the user experience compared to what we get with universal viewer, which, by its very nature of being universal, it doesn't necessarily offer an optimal UX for video and audio work. And with it, I think it really depends on the use case. If you have a repository that's mainly images and documents with a smattering of AV, then UV might be a better choice. But if you have a user base and a repository that's very intensely AV focused or has a lot of AV, then this might be something you'd want to consider.
That makes sense to me. I think that that's probably the more compelling argument, since step one, download React automatically means that the size of it isn't really smaller. But I think that the more customized UX, that feels like a very compelling argument. Thank you.
Let's see. I see a question from Ben in the chat. Metadata beyond label to the structured navigation akin to segment descriptions. Not right now. So the current design hews very closely to our existing XML-based schema for representing structure in Avalon. And so it's very locked to that. I think it would certainly be interesting, yeah, to have the ability to sort of render more or different data structures in terms of, just having a structured navigation component. But it's sort of outside the scope that we've been looking at right now. Sort of the first step was basically, let's re-implement the sort of rendered structure that we already have.
I'd also just like to add, it's great to see how this has come along in the time since I last checked in with you about this project.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah.
A few years ago. I have another kind of related question. How are you composing the web VTT transcripts?
Good question. You mean in terms of web VTTs that get fed in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try and be cute or obscure about this. So we have, you might remember a kind of similar project that we're not super fond of, and have been looking at tracking the progress of your project to see the degree to which it might hit a pivot point for us to try and start using it and start making proposals for contributions over there. And one of our big use cases is to function as an ohms alike, both on the researcher side, of course, which I think you have largely with the synchronized transcripts, although there I think it's searching the segment descriptions is the big missing piece. But then the other side is, we frequently have someone come into our management application with a plain text transcript, and then they set a grad student to work synchronizing it or describing the segments or something like that. What you clearly have data like that. So does that data, what's the tooling to create that data?
It's a good question. We were just talking about that this morning. I think the tooling is sort of something that we're still figuring out. I think it's the way I see it, it's like web VTT and sort of captions and the overlap between them is something that appears, and I think a lot of implementations are like this one as it is, or like Aviary, where sort of the expectation is that the transcript will be in web VTT, which sort of imposes a certain order on the transcript data. And there are ways to render the information out. So for example, in paragraphs, and have word or phrase level timed chunks be navigable as, like underlined sections on mouse over or something like that. And an interesting example of this is Alexander Street Press, who uses a custom JSON schema that serves as both the renders both as the transcript data, as like in the transcript view, and also as captions within the player itself. And so, sort of the question is like, what's coming in and how do you render it? I think I would prefer for this project to, be as generic as possible in terms of accommodating different types of transcript data, because, realistically, there's a lot of just untimed plain text or lightly formatted rich text documents. And then there are things like a web VTT file where you might want to represent it as a transcript, but by default, most render it as, individual bits in paragraphs, which isn't really a good reading experience and doesn't really hew closely to what a transcript document usually looks like when it's in the normal presentation. And so it's kind of a storage versus representation question.
Yeah, we've definitely found, even when we want to use WebVTT as a common transport format, that the caption stream and the synchronized transcript stream actually ought to have different markup, precisely for some of the reasons that you're describing, but also because what makes for a good reading experience and the transcript navigation often makes for a very poor viewing experience when you have these huge blocks of text overlaying it. That's kind of going down a rabbit hole. So I hope we can talk more about this in another channel.
Yeah, no, this is, definitely things that I've been thinking a lot about.